Welcome everyone! I'm playing a strong chess event in the Reykjavik Opera Hall. Today, I played the scariest creature known to man. A teenager. It's true, I feared him. He was only 1700, but teens are always rapidly improving and thus underrated. Here's how the game went. I started off with my usual opening. He continued with d5. I played knight to f3, knight to f6, and here I had a decision. Do I want to play the London? Do I want to play my usual c4 stuff? Or do I want to go for the Catalan, which I have only recently learned, and honestly, I was feeling kind of intimidated with how my new openings have been going so far in the tournament, so I really didn't want to play it. Then I remembered, I'm here to learn. The only way to learn and actually get comfortable with new openings is to play them in a real tournament setting. So I went for it and I played my Catalan. He continued with e6, and here I continued with bishop g2, which was a slight inaccuracy in my move order. I am supposed to play c4 first. I didn't think that it would make a difference, but then he played c5, and I realized it does make a difference. Chess at tournament levels is so crazy because even a slight move order change will make a big difference in your opening. Here, the best computer move was c4, and I knew that this was a line, but when I calculated it, I wasn't super comfortable, especially because I was playing against a lower rated, and when I do that, I tend to prefer playing positions that are more complicated so that they have a higher chance of making a mistake rather than lines where we trade off a lot of pieces and it's more simple play. The line that I was worried about after c4 was d takes c4. I cannot recapture on c5 because then he trades off my queen, and he's a lot better in this position because my king is in the center of the board. I can no longer castle, and he recaptures my pawn with a tempo, putting pressure on the f2 square, and he's up a pawn, so no bueno. So instead, in this position, I would have to castle, and what I was afraid about here was if he would capture my d4 pawn. I can't take back with the knight because he gets bishop c5 with tempo, and this is a pretty good line for him. If I defend with my pawn, I might end up getting an isolated pawn, on top of the fact that I'm already down a pawn because that's how the Catalan is, and it's a crazy opening. But it's okay, I'm a crazy girl, so I usually like it. Okay, so I would have had to instead take with the queen, queen takes, knight takes, and even though this line is somewhat tricky, when I play lower rateds, I usually don't want to be forced to trade off my queen because I think it gives them better drawing chances. So I didn't go for this line, and I decided to play something a little bit unusual, hoping that I could throw him off. So instead of playing the most accurate c4 move, I decided to castle. That being said, I could already hear Hammer's voice in my head telling the chat that I had made the wrong decision, but it's okay, because I was aware and I was doing it intentionally. He developed his knight, and here I decided to just protect my pawn on d4. And usually when you're defending a central pawn, you want to defend it with a pawn from the side. So I played c3, and the reason for that is because if he takes, you get to take with one of your side pawns and bring it into the center. So that's why playing c3 is a better move than playing something like e3, in addition to the fact that it would have blocked my own bishop. Here, he played bishop to d6. I decided to no longer rush my openings because that's when I make a lot of mistakes. So I decided to sit here and not just make moves that feel right, like developing my pieces, but actually think of a plan and how I'm supposed to play this position. And I was really struggling here. I was thinking of moves like bishop g5, but then he would just push me away. I was thinking of moves like taking the pawn, bishop takes, developing my bishop, but then he gets a big pawn center. I was also thinking of moves like bishop g5, he pushes, I trade off the knight, queen takes, and I push the pawn. I trade off my bishop pair, but I keep the position closed. But I didn't really love the chances because I figured at some point black is going to get e5, open his position, and I'm just worse off. I also thought of moves like taking out my knight to try to go for some kind of e4 pawn push, but then I would block my own position and it was just getting incredibly awkward. So, after much resistance to playing c4, I knew that I had to go for some kind of plan that included it here, and I noticed that since his bishop was on d6, I could actually avoid the queen trade. So I took, and Another tip, usually in positions like this, you wait for black to move their bishop once, because if he was on his starting square and I took, he would develop his bishop for free. But this way, he wasted a move, I gain a tempo, and I take his pawn now. And now I finally pushed c4. What I liked about this is that if he takes my pawn, I will be able to recapture it with queen c7 or queen a4, and I'm not trading off my queen. Instead, he castled, I took, and the correct move for him was to recapture with his pawn. He gets an isolated pawn in the center, which then shapes my plan, and I start putting pressure on it, especially with my fianchettoed bishop. In exchange, he gets a lot of space in the center of the board and easy development. That being said, I could tell why he was nervous to get an isolated pawn, and he instead took with the knight. Here I played queen c2 to put pressure on his bishop and prepare the d1 square for my rook. I wanted to put my rook on the open file. He played queen to b6, which I felt was a little bit of a mistake here. Basically, he was taking away this square from his knight and from his bishop. I moved a3. I wanted to prevent the knight from hopping over to b4 and kicking my queen out. Here, his position was a little bit awkward because his bishop on c8 would have a really hard time to develop. That being said, I was also behind in development because I had two pieces that I needed to take out. Here he played knight to d4, attacking my queen and the knight, so I was forced to trade. Here he recaptured with the bishop, and in this position I was considering two plans. One was bringing my knight to d2 and then over to f3. What I liked about this is that I would be able to bring my knight to a better square and then my bishop would be free and I'd put pressure on his bishop. If I could win the bishop pair, that would be a nice advantage for me. But what I didn't like is the pressure that the bishop would continue having on my pawn. And I also came up with another plan that I knew had a flaw, but I liked how quickly it would let me develop. So I pushed my pawn to e3, putting pressure on his pawn. He moved back, and here I pushed my pawn to e4. This is a good move because it pushes the knight back into awkward development, but it also creates a problem where I'm blocking my own bishop. I thought this trade-off was worth it, but my coach did give me a little slap on the wrist after saying I need to study my pawn structures.
I still think I need to figure out if we can find some like training exercises for pawn structures. Because this game was also a nice illustration of how the pawn structure didn't really work in your favor, with your pawn blocking your own bishop.
So here I continued developing. He did the same with his bishop. I brought out my bishop with tempo, attacking his queen and developing. He moved his queen to the side, which I thought was a good move because it would continue putting pressure on my knight. Here I played rook to d1, putting my rook on an open file with tempo, which he defended. And here I think I played inaccurately. I was really not liking the pressure that my opponent had on my c3 knight, and I moved my bishop over to d4 to get rid of it. I had calculated this line with b4, pushing the queen back, defending my knight, and then looking over at rook c8, and I didn't like the pressure my opponent had on my knight. That being said, one thing that I made a mistake here that I'm going to try to improve in future games is I didn't go deep enough into the variation to accurately understand how strong this position was. I was so worried about the pin that I didn't think about the move queen b3. Here it looks like I'm losing a knight, but after he takes, I just move my rook up and the bishop is pinned, and in this position, I get to keep my bishop pair and activate my rook, so this would have been a really beautiful position. Instead, I'm a human, I make mistakes, I played bishop d4. The reason why this was a mistake is because he took my bishop, I took with the rook, and here he should have played his knight over to c6, because now I would have to move my rook back. He would develop his knight with tempo, and basically most of the advantage I had in the position was the fact that I was up in development, so he'd be quickly catching up here. Yes, he has an awkward bishop on d7, but now my own bishop is also blocked by my pawn. Instead, he pushed e5, which was also an okay move. I moved my rook back, and now he played his bishop to e6 to start trading off my rooks. Here I doubled up my rooks. I didn't like the idea of knight to d5 because I thought that I would end up losing a pawn here. So I brought over my rook, he traded, and I decided to take with the rook. I didn't like taking with the queen because I thought that after he brings out his knight, he's gonna kick my queen off of the open file. So I took with the rook. He brought out his knight, looking towards the outpost on d4. I put my knight on my own outpost as well, and here he brought his knight to the center, attacking my queen. I had three options here: queen to c3, queen to d3, and queen to d1. I didn't like queen to d1 because I was afraid of this move. I wouldn't be able to take because queen takes rook. I also wouldn't want to push my pawn because this would weaken my king side. The computer had a crazy move here for why he liked this, and it was knight to f6, but unfortunately for me, I'm not a robot and I didn't see this. I also considered queen c3, but I was kind of worried after queen takes, pawn takes, knight attacks my rook. Let's say I attack the knight, trying to put pressure on the pawn. He moves knight to c5, and here I've traded off queens, it's less complex, and I have a terrible pawn structure. So my last option to defend the rook, and of course I also couldn't move my queen to c1 because he would just kick me out, was queen to d3. And here, he played a move that I thought looked weird, but it actually made a lot of sense. He moved his king to f8, and the reason for that is because he wanted to put his rook on the open file. He couldn't do it right away because I would fork his rook and his king. I thought that moving the queen to c5 would have been a better move because he could have gotten the open file right away and he would be defending the square on e7. That being said, I understand where he was coming from, and if we would ever trade queens in this situation, he would actually want his king to be closer to the center anyway. In this position, I was starting to feel extremely nervous. I thought that my position was actually slightly worse than his. That being said, I knew I could hold a draw, but I didn't want to draw. Again, he was lower rated and I was not ready to lose more elo. The one thing that I had going for me was the fact that my opponent was starting to get very low on the clock, so I wanted to somehow use that pressure. I thought about a lot of different plans here, like moving my pawn to f4 to put pressure on this pawn. He cannot take because then I would win his knight in the center, but I couldn't really find a great line after he would push his pawn over. Even if I would take, he takes, let's say I get some kind of check here, he would just move his king back, and I didn't see a great continuation from here. So because I couldn't find any plan, I decided that his queen is more active than my queen, so I should at least go for the trade. I played queen c3 with the plan of queen takes, knight takes, because I didn't want to ruin my pawn structure, and hoping that I'd still be able to make it tricky from here. That being said, this position looks incredibly drawish, and had he taken my queen, this position would have very likely been a draw. Luckily for me, I am the inventor of a very strong chess move called the Botez Gambit, and I think that puts fear in the hearts of my opponent to take my queen. I don't blame them. So instead, he made a blunder here. He played queen to d8. And the problem with this move is that now I can play queen check, attacking the king and the pawn at the same time. Here he moved his king to e8, which I thought was a big mistake because now that the queens are on the board, you don't want your king in the center of the board. He should have just gone back. And I'm pretty sure I gave the camera a confused look as well because I wanted my audience to know that I didn't understand that move. But again, I'm not blaming him here. He was under a lot of time pressure and he was probably thinking that if there's some kind of trades, he wants to have his king in the center. Here I actually missed a really strong plan, and the reason why I missed it is because I had thought about it so many times before, thought the plan didn't work, that I didn't realize what changed in this position. I should have played f4 here, and the reason is that if he played the move that I was afraid of before, f6, I could take the pawn on e5, f takes, and now because his king is in the center of the board, I can move my rook to f2, making sure that his king is going to be stuck here, and now in an open position I would have a lot of attacking chances. But alas, I'm a greedy goblin and I just took his pawn happily. Here the computer actually suggested a line which I was not afraid of at all. The computer really liked bishop takes knight, pawn takes. I wasn't really afraid of this because I thought, hey, I'm up a pawn, I'm going to have a passed pawn as well. I know that this pawn was kind of dangerous, but I didn't really see why I should be afraid of it. The reason was that he would have a move like queen c8, which would basically force a queen trade, otherwise I get checked and lose my rook. And after I trade, the rook has the open file, and without the queens on the board and his king closer to my pawn actually becomes a weakness, and he has good counterplay chances here. But I didn't see that, and neither did my opponent. He played rook to c8, looking towards the last rank. I pushed my pawn up so that my king would have an escape square. Once again, the computer really liked taking here, but that was not a plan that either of us saw. So he checked me, which I think was the natural continuation to his plan. I moved my king up, and here he made another mistake. He moved his bishop back to attack my queen, and I just gobbled up another pawn. Here he moved his queen to g5. He was getting very low on the clock, around 2 minutes or so, and he played a move that the computer doesn't think is accurate, but as a human, when you're low on time, you're already in a worse position. I like this. I like going for aggressive moves. He was putting pressure on my rook, and if it was his turn to move, he could actually take the pawn on h3. If I take with the bishop, I get forked, and if I take with the king, I get checkmated. So I like the fact that he was going for threats, because if I had somehow fallen for this, he could have saved his game. Here I was considering the move f4 and queen check. f4 would have been slightly better, but instead I gave a queen check. He attacked my queen, and I moved over to defend my rook. Here, the trickiest continuation for him, I thought, was bishop takes. Again, I can't take with the bishop or the king here, so I thought this would have been a pretty tricky line, but I think that I could have taken the bishop, knight checks, and king moves over, and now he wouldn't be able to take my rook because I would be able to check the king has to move over, and now I would go check and end up with a checkmate. So that's probably why he didn't go for it. Here he played quickly. He moved knight to c6, attacking my queen, and as you notice, there's no squares my queen can go to that continue defending my rook. But instead, I had a tricky move. The move was queen to d6, and here he cannot take my rook because I give a discovery check, attacking the king and also the queen. Here, he played in haste once again. He pushed the pawn to h5, and I played knight to c7 check, which leads to checkmate in one move. He resigned here, but had he moved the king over, I would have taken the bishop and the game would be over. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really appreciated all of the support during the tournament. Bye!